Good to go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education, Friday, April 28th, 2:07 p.m. A little late starting, so we've switched things around because the floor went long. We're going to spend time first about an hour on PCB testing with Matt Chapman and then Paul Burns. Then at 3 o'clock, Mike Smith, the interim president of Vermont State University, is going to join us here for a conversation. After that, we will just keep going through all of our agenda items that we postponed earlier in the day and hopefully make it through. So with that, Mr. Chapman, PCB testing in schools. We have folks in committee who have, I think, generally will have questions. They've been asking questions. There's been a lot of information out there. And we thought it could be helpful to have the agency back in to talk to us a little bit and just fill us in on why you think it's important that PCB testing not be paused. I think, and I don't want to speak for the committee, but there seems to be a couple of things I would say. Well, this isn't the committee, I would say from emails from one representative I wrote, we don't want to disrupt the lives of kids. And then we have the agency of the Commissioner of Health and our former Commissioner of Health say, this is about kids. This is about health and kids. Then I'll hear something about this needs to be more in line with school construction. And so those are some of the things that I think people are kind of grappling with. Sure. But if you could just sort of kick this off, and this would be a great time for us to ask you questions so we all understand what a pause would mean and what it would mean. And also help and remind us, as I think we have all been told, it's really not a pause. Right. So, floor is yours.
Sure. For the record, my name is Matt Chapman. I'm the director of the Waste Management Prevention Division. Within that division, there is a program that basically oversees the remediation of contaminated sites. So the things you think about in, Windsor County, like in Springfield and Windsor, or in Burlington, the Pine Street Barge Canal, and frankly some of the brownfields cleanups. So basically, what I did, and I provided this electronically, and I believe there are paper copies as well. I kind of tried to summarize a lot of sort of what the program is, both because I think the committee's had a lot of testimony, but it's been spaced out over time, and hopefully this is helpful to just sort of summarize what's going on at sort of the very simple, at a simple level, what the program is doing.
Yes, and this is, I saw this because you did send it to the pro tem. He made me aware of it, and so I appreciate sharing this with the committee.
You're welcome. So, again, just to sort of loop back, which I think everybody knows, PCBs are known carcinogens, and they have also significant non-cancer health effects. They were used in building materials such as caulking, glues, and mastics, and as insulation and electrical equipment between roughly 1930 and 1980. And in 1979, EPA basically banned the use of PCBs. Over the past several years, and I think Dr. Hornbuckle sort of underlined this, we've become increasingly aware of the impacts of inhalation of PCBs as a receptor to basically an adverse human health receptor. And so indoor air at schools, and again, I think Dr. Hornbuckle went through this, often have ambient air concentrations higher than at federal Superfund sites that have been remediated for PCBs. And roughly 40% of schools have been tested to date exceed the standards, but not all of those exceedances are equal, right? Like there are some that have some issues that we need to work through. Some of them are still need to be worked on, but they haven't, frankly, I think, posed any issue whatsoever to school operations. So the program's been developed to basically, as I said, sort of test for PCBs in schools, thoughtfully and frankly in consultation with national experts and Vermont school officials. We follow sort of an existing set of practices we have for cleaning up contaminated properties. So that allows us to basically use sort of practices that have been in place for about the past 45 years to help guide decision-making processes for how we go through and investigate and clean up schools. We have a group of consultants in the state that are familiar with those practices and understand how to basically conduct the investigation that needs to be conducted to both identify where the contamination's at and how you clean it up. And there are about 20 people in my division who work for me who are basically analysts who help those and oversee those consultants do the work. So when we developed the program, we reached out to, and I guess we also reached out before we sort of started this to EPA, Dr. Hornbuckle, and to the consulting community generally in the state to try and advise us on how to create a PCB testing program like this and work through challenges and issues before we actually get into a school setting. And I think equally important try, and I think this is something we improve upon every time we have an issue, improve our way of communicating with schools and trying to learn from schools what the best way of communicating with them is and how we can help them. Because I do think, in my experience, each school is different. Each school needs to have basically time devoted when there's an issue to help work that school through the issue, communicate with people, and we do what we can to devote as much personal time when there's a significant issue as possible to work with those schools to address the issues. So again, we worked with outside experts, school officials before the program began, and then we've sort of continued to adapt the program as we've been out there to sort of address and build, take their concerns into consideration. We've tried to make efforts to be adaptive and flexible while also making sure that we're consistent in protecting health. So when we developed the list of schools that were going through the program, we prioritized schools that were likely to have the highest levels of PCBs based on the history of the school, both its construction history and sort of the age of the building, and also focused on populations that have the highest percentage of free and reduced lunch as sort of a metric to make sure that we're hitting some of the most vulnerable Vermont populations as early as we can in the process. And then lastly, sort of going on, the program also took into consideration the lessons. Frankly, the Department of Health was in the front line of learning, but we certainly had some experience on the impacts of disrupted learning on students and frankly, trying to minimize this program's impact on schools and school operations. And basically, some of the things that we've tried to do in building this are allowing schools to continue using impacted rooms for limited periods of time while we're trying to consider what the cleanup options are and also whether there are mitigation options that we can sort of bring the levels down on a short-term basis to keep those rooms unimpacted. And the other thing that we try to do is, again, use mitigation measures, sort of increase ventilation, increase filtration, or sort of barriers between the PCB containing material and the student to allow unrestricted the area while you try and come up with whatever the final solution for dealing with the problems are. And once we actually have reached the point of mitigating the issue, bringing things below the IAL and ideally below the SAL, so it's sort of below our standards, we can be adaptive with the school and basically speed things up if there are community concerns and they want to try and accelerate cleanup alternatives, whether that be based on school schedule or just general public concern. Or alternatively, if there are future construction considerations that a school wants to take into account in doing the cleanup, we can slow the cleanup down, right? Like there's once we've mitigated the risk, we can take time in doing the final cleanup. So that is an option that's out there and it's on the table. So that's sort of a very broad brush overview of what the program is. I think there's one thing that I would like to just point out on the pause bill of 486 that's passed the House, and something that is of significant concern to me. People refer to it as pausing the program. I don't believe that it does. What it does is it terminates ANR's ability, or excuse me, the Agency of Education's ability to fund the investigation portion of the program for any schools going forward. My reading of the bill is it does not pause the school's obligation to test. If you go back, if you go back through the laws and how it was written, the obligation to test is placed on the school, and the state has an obligation to fund that testing. It pauses the funding. It doesn't pause the requirement to test. So The Agency of Natural Resources thinks it's really important to continue with this program, but if the committee doesn't choose to do that, I don't think the House effectuated what they intended to do with the bill that they passed.
Can you, I just want to make sure I fully understand what you said. Just run it by me one more time. I just want to make sure I fully understand.
So with the bill as passed the House, or
Of
just
what
generally
you're,
with
the concern that you just expressed, can you just?
well,
say
so with respect to so two concerns, right? One is the bill is passed. The way it works is it basically ends the Agency of Education's funding opportunities for any schools. It stops the testing and basically curtails funding any cleanup for schools that haven't been tested after the bill has been adopted. Basically pauses the funding. But if you look back, this is not necessarily, there's a number of enactments for PCBs in schools with different obligations and different funding sources and different places. But at the end of the day, there's a requirement on schools to do the testing by 2025. And there's no pause or termination of that 2025 testing obligation date. My reading of H 486 is that the obligation to test continues to exist, but the state's ability to fund that testing obligation goes away. And then I guess I would just say, so back to the sort of underlying issue, the agency, and I think I certainly speak for the other agencies as well.
Just wait 1 second on that one, just while I'm thinking about it. Sure. So the House wants testing to continue as written. At least the bill says continue to test, but to stop the AOE from funding the testing.
The way the bill was constructed, it ends the funding for the testing.
And requires.
It fails to address the actual act of the testing occurring, right? So you will remember, Senator, you put a deadline in, there was a deadline placed for testing. That deadline runs to schools, not to A&R. So the schools remain obligated to complete the testing. We just wouldn't have the funding to provide money to test.
Did the House, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I still have it in my head. Would that funding requirement then fall on the schools or the state?
Schools.
Schools.
Okay.
But I thought that this bill gets rid of that 80-20 split and makes it so that the state is fully responsible for the spending.
So it does for any school that had tested prior to the effective date of 486, it does get rid of that funding obligation, or that 80-20 split. It makes it a 100%. For any school after the effective date, there's no contracts or funding available to do the work, but the work still needs to be done for testing.
May I just ask a quick, did the House happen to have you testify?
I was never asked to testify on the bill. No.
I mean, we're finding this with this bill that, it sounds like it was largely Superintendent's Association, but I'm glad you're here, and this is very helpful.
So
Yes.
I think there's a misconception out there. The emails I've been getting are want to pause the testing because they think the school districts themselves are going to have to pay for it. So is there a policy letter or a letter that explains that we could put out there for people to see?
Yeah, we could always draft an email to, I know I've been responding to a bunch of different people, but this is new information to me also. I don't think this has been shared in committee yet, has it?
Yeah,
Was it earlier?
I feel like this really confuses the issue a lot more from what I previously understood.
Yeah.
I'm not putting blame on.
Oh, I didn't mean to confuse. So
No,
right.
it confuses my own previous understanding of what the bill does. And I'm just sharing.
Senator Weeks?
I think we can score that away, but it's a good highlight. We just need to square with what the language really says, what it really does.
Yeah, please.
And to be clear, I'm sure that wasn't the intent of what the drafters of that bill intended to do, but in reading it and going through the various sort of enactments that are out there, that's my opinion is what the effect is, which is why I wanted to flag it to make sure that if the committee chose to move forward.
We're deeply, immensely grateful. We put almost all 4086 except the pause in the bill. So if we had moved forward, this would have been, or what we refer to sometimes as the pause. Yeah, Senator.
Could you, just for clarity, could you just read to us where you're, just so I know where you're seeing that?
Sure, actually, what I'll do, and maybe what is better, and I'm happy to actually provide a supplemental sort of statement to you, because the legal requirement for schools to test is actually not in what's being amended here. So I can give you the reference to where there's a deadline for schools to test by 2025, so that's clear.
You're gonna provide it before 2025?
I will definitely provide it before 2025, yes.
Question.
Yeah, please.
So very clearly, you outlined that approximately 40% of schools tested today exceed Vermont standards. PCBs. What percentage of schools have already been tested of the overall population? And what percentage of schools were scheduled in the first wave to be tested?
So
Give us a sense of where we're.
sure, and I can give you a good number on how many have been tested, but I mean, I think the goal was to frankly start a little slow so that we could work through a few schools at a slower pace and have an understanding of what's going on, and then increase basically through the time we're in right now, the number of schools that have been tested. I will tell you. Give me a second. I have that data.
And I'm actually not going to assume that, I don't know what the House wants at this point, frankly. I mean, it's been out there for a long time. I'm really not sure what they want, so it's leave to them. Maybe this was their intention, who knows? Maybe it was just a mistake.
I think at the time, my sense is at the time of drafting, they transferred it back to us, that it was their intent almost. Had nothing to do with funding. Just wanted to stall until school construction was sure.
So as of Monday, 20% of the schools had been authorized. We had basically approved purchase orders for them to move forward and be tested. So we don't know how many contractors have actually been on site and done the work.
Okay, so 20% authorized. I know that 20%. How many have actually kicked off?
What we do is we work with the consultants to basically authorize their authority under our contract to move forward. And sometimes sometimes they go right out that day. Sometimes it's a week. It depends on the availability of the contractor, and then they report to us once they've done the testing.
Right, got that.
Okay.
But how many of them have started? Or how many have been triggered to start? You know, whatever
So there are
metric-
67 schools that have been sort of authorized to test. And there are 97 schools that we've sort of begun the process on. So the first thing we do when we start this process is we actually go out to the school and conduct the building inventory and look at how building materials, HVAC systems, other sort of common PCB containing materials might be in like rooms. So it's a fairly detailed analysis that we go through to basically reduce the cost of testing and improve the accuracy, we believe, of the information that we're collecting. It also, I think, helps us when we get to a point where we find a problem to focus in on the areas that might be the source of that problem.
Right. My question is really just get around how far down the total first phase of testing have you contracted or have you exercised?
So we're contracted to basically test all of them. We've authorized contractors to go forward and test on 20% of them.
20% first set, not 20% of the total population.
So 20% of the total population. So 67 schools out of the 321 that are in the testing program.
You have contracts with those.
So we have contracts, so the way we structured our contracts, they're basically PCB testing and remediation contracts.
Okay.
And they cover all 321 schools, right? And what we do is we've scheduled out with the contractors how they're gonna, which schools go first. And we work with districts and schools if they wanna make adjustments based on population concerns, or alternatively, if they have a construction project and they want to push themselves back further down the list, if they're going to replace, say, their HVAC unit, rather than going this summer, they want to go next summer, we can accommodate those to some degree. So the contracts cover everything. That 20% is basically, we basically have signed an authorization for the contractor to go out to that school and do the work. And so I don't have the numbers of like whether they've actually tested today, right?
So we were told the testing was gonna be complete in October. It's not for all schools.
So the testing is scheduled to be complete by 2025.
So are there enough contractors to do that budget?
So we currently have enough contractors that we will meet that. We think we're going to meet that deadline. We are on pace to meet that deadline.
Yes.
Thank you for your testimony. A couple of things, my general sense about folks wanting a pause on this is just that there's a financial requirement in the case that the levels are, over the triggered amount of action levels that schools have budgeted for. They just haven't budgeted. They weren't expecting it. They're not prepared for it. I mean, is your agency prepared to help those communities that might have to cut other funds, for example, staffing or programs in a school because they have to fund this this testing program that's been imposed on them?
So I'm going to defer to the Agency of Education on funding formula and how funding takes place. I mean, we certainly support we have conversations and support, but I mean, they're effectively excess ed fund dollars, and they're kind of the lead on with the schools on funding and how funding moves forward. I mean, certainly, again, getting back to, trying to work to accommodate schools' needs. We can work to accommodate schools' needs on what the cleanup pathway is. So there's some pathways that are more expensive than others, right? So we can certainly work with schools on that. We can also accommodate things on timing if there's a need to work on that. I mean, obviously too, we're happy and we have tried to work to see whether there are other opportunities for funding beyond that end.
And my other question is, have you worked at all at reducing the level of panic and fear that this might be fomenting in a community? And the reason I ask that is because one thing that we learned in COVID, at least I learned, is that there are some kids, frankly, who are much safer at school than they are not in school. And so I am concerned that when panic is created in a community, you get kids being pulled out. That's worrisome. And I also just want to reiterate that this is obviously a multi-pronged, complex thing that we're dealing with. And I have to quote my husband again, guys. I know you've heard it already, but I thought this was a great quote. Oftentimes here in this building, we are voting a binary on an issue that is not at all binary. And I really feel like that's the case here. This is like a really complex, multi-pronged issue, and we're going to be voting yes or no. Right, which is unfortunate, but sorry, go ahead.
So no, so first of all, trying to address the community concerns is really front of mind in a lot of what we do. And I think that we've tried to take the approach of really devoting, when we have sort of an exceedance of an immediate action level, sort of higher level, to really give time and personal attention to a school to help figure out what the school needs as far as communication assistance. Yeah, I'm going down next week to have a conversation with the school, right, and walking a community through some of the issues that are there. You know, I think we've learned a lot through the process, and I think that we also, you know, we've been able, and I think this is one of the reasons why this program is good, and I don't want to pause or change it, is that I think it really is geared towards trying to keep students in school. We try to make changes to accommodate that. Work with the health department to try and make sure that happens, while concurrently making sure they're safe and not exposed to chemicals. But I think we appreciate there are two concerns out there, and you're right. This is a complicated program, and I think sometimes, you know, there's some people have said, well, lead in school, lead in the drinking water fountains, you know, why isn't this as easy as that? And unfortunately, PCBs are a lot more complicated than addressing lead in a drinking water supply. They're unfortunately equally or more dangerous, right? So it's trying to figure out how, you know, addressing the issue as well as we can. But I agree in trying to keep people as calm, understanding that you know, normally these are extended exposure risks that we're talking about. We can address these problems. It's not normally an immediate impact by being present in the school. We can try and, you know, do a lot of things to minimize exposures and mitigate the harm.
Yeah, extended exposure. Yeah, people don't always understand that.
And you're talking to people about that. Communication.
We are, and you know, I mean, I think we've had the benefit, and if you know, and I think the health department and particularly like Dr. Post or Dr. Cragen, who were the public health section, it might be worth the committee seeing the changes that have been made to sort of how we approach this. We're looking at multiple different occupancy scenarios for how a school can tailor how they're using rooms when there's an issue, right? It's not saying you can't use rooms. Maybe you should reduce the number of hours that you're in that room. Maybe we can help you move around to a different sort of using that your room setting differently. So, and sometimes we, you know, when we're in a situation where that particular room is critical to school operations, we do have the ability to do sort of a site-specific review of what's going on. So that is an option as well.
Oh, sorry, Weeks has had his hand up.
So if I could, I wanted to rephrase Senator Gielick's question a little bit. Who's in charge of communications? Is it A&R? Is it AOE? Is it?
So to a large degree, especially on the sort of health and risk communication, health takes the lead on that. They are really good. They have a health communication staff and certainly are the ones who, you know, talk about that. I mean, basically, if you think about the team, right? You know, health is really there to help understand and communicate the health issues and the health risks. We're there to talk about what the next steps are in the cleanup options and how we sort of fix the problem. And the Agency of Education is there to help both of us and the schools understand like what school operations are, how they work, and frankly, liaise with the schools and be a funding resource for them, right? So we have weekly meetings and meet actually a lot more than that, trying to keep everybody up to speed. But
And it took us 2 years to set this up, frankly.
it did.
Yeah. Senator Hashim?
You previously mentioned extended exposure, and just to go back to that, when you're talking about extended exposure, are you talking 5 years, 10 years, a couple months, or?
So again, the health department's probably the better person to get at that. But I mean, normally when you look at, I think Dr. Levine's statement was that these are really focused on the non-cancer risks associated with PCB exposure, and that normally my understanding is you're looking at 1-year exposure periods for that when that happens. So, but again, I would talk to the Department of Health if that's something.
Do you mind if we switch you out of the witness chair? We have you have a follow-up, if we can keep going. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have one last question for you that I haven't asked yet. It's something I've just recently feel like I'm learning, which is that the younger the child, the more vulnerable they are to PCBs. And so I'm wondering, are you testing daycares, childcare centers, preschools, at least ones that aren't in public schools?
No, and the only reason that the reason we're not is
Well, if they are in public schools.
if they are in public
Right,
schools,
right.
yes,
The ones that
obviously,
are.
right?
Yeah.
The ones that are, we're not. I mean, we certainly would have considered doing something like that. This is a legislatively mandated program, and we're focused on what the legislature mandated us to do. I mean, I agree, right? Like pre-K, preschool, that's another area where you would potentially want to focus your efforts and resources.
You don't mind sticking around, Mr. Chaff? We're gonna have Mr. Burns, and then we'll get to 3:00 stuff, and we have Mike Smith coming in at 3. From the state college. Mr. Burns, how are you? It's rare that, I don't think you've been in Senate Ed
Quite a while.
quite a while. Yeah, it's good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please.
For the opportunity, for the record, my name is Paul Burns. I'm the executive director of VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. And this is my 23rd legislative session with VPIRG, but it is true, it's rare that I get to talk with the education committee. So I do appreciate this chance. VPIRG, I think most of you are somewhat familiar with us. We have a broad range of issues that we work on, from climate and energy to environmental health, public health, healthcare, democracy, and consumer protection issues, all kind of in the broad range of things that we work on. I personally have spent most of my time on environmental health issues over my many years with VPIRG. We have in the past, it's interesting if listening to your conversation, we've been involved in many pieces of legislation and policy that have tried to protect public health from exposure to toxic chemicals. And oftentimes those policies have paid particular attention to the risks for our most vulnerable, which is often children, pregnant women, people with weakened immune systems. So 9 years ago, we passed the legislation dealing with chemicals of high concern to children, and trying to, and have been a really national leader in efforts like that, trying to identify particular risks to those who are maybe more susceptible to the harmful effects of chemical exposures. We certainly worked with this committee, your counterparts in the House as well, on the legislation dealing with lead in drinking water in schools at that time, and for many of the same reasons that we're talking about here. A well-known, really no dispute about whether lead is a hazard to human health, and really no disputes, I imagine, about whether PCBs are a threat to human health. A little bit different than something like methylene chloride, which is a chemical used in paint strippers and other things. And I mention that only because in the last 48 hours, it's been disclosed that after many years of effort in my organization and others have been pressing for this, the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level has finally taken action to address in commercial respects they're not going to allow methylene chloride in these kind of stripper products for any longer in the future. It'll take another year before that rule becomes finalized, of course, because these things always take a long time. But that's a situation where you had people who were using it, 1 day or 1 hour, the next hour, next day they are dead. I mean, that's a kind of acute exposure. And I'm not saying it happened often, but it happens. It's happened dozens of times, I think more than 60 times in this country that links to this. And so I'm pleased to see that. And that's part of federal legislation that we have to try to address these hazards. But oftentimes, the government is a little bit behind when it comes to regulating chemicals. And even in cases where, as with PCBs, the risk was known, identified, and addressed. PCBs have not been used in building supplies and other things for more than 40 years. In 1979, I guess it was banned. But the risk remains. I mean, these chemicals are stable in the environment and can continue to present risk. I'm not going to belabor that point. I just wanted to say we come to this with the idea that generally one of precaution. There is something when we look at regulations of chemicals from an environmental or public health standpoint, something called the precautionary principle. And that can be defined in different ways, but it basically means taking preventive action, even in the case of some uncertainty, where there is enough information to tell you that there's a potential, or even in this case, a known risk. You should act from a preventive standpoint. You should engage the public as much as possible in that kind of process. You should put the burden on the party that would introduce the chemical into a place where people could be exposed to it in order to, in other words, they should have to prove it safe before it gets out there. These are all kind of ways of looking at a precautionary approach. Normally, or oftentimes now, we talk about the precautionary approach where we're talking about new chemicals entering the marketplace, and that's where that idea of the burden on the manufacturer comes into play. Here, the chemicals have been in and been addressed in terms of the marketplace, but it's still out there. And so I guess it's a question of how you define what is a preventive approach at this point. And sorry.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No,
you.
no, no.
When you're done with that, I can chime in.
Okay. But I think that's a question, and certainly one that would drive our perspective on this issue. We have supported the state's testing program in order to identify for two reasons, I guess. One is to certainly identify the places where there is a real risk to the health of the students, the faculty, the other staff who may be in that building on a day-to-day basis. And the other is so that the state can have the information that you all need as policymakers to make an informed decision as you look at all of the needs of our aging infrastructure. And in this respect, I go by the old saying, knowledge is power. It is helpful. It is simply helpful to have this information to know, okay, senators, you are asking the question, how many of these tests have begun and how many are underway? Where are we in that process? And because the closer you are to final, the closer you are to knowing, all right, now we can have a better sense of how much money might this cost us. I mean, and I want to say, those are tough questions. And I don't envy you. And, positions you're in every single day. You're taking positions on lots of important things, and you're weighing priorities. And there are limited dollars and unlimited needs. I have a sense of that. And some of them are coming from me, and so I understand your burden in that respect. I don't think, and Friedberg's position is not to pause the testing program, because I don't think that helps to solve that challenge that you face in having to make those decisions. And it certainly is unhelpful if our goal is to try to be as protective as possible of public health and of the health of folks who as children may have a still developing immune system. There are I've seen statistics on teachers, and most of whom are female in the state, many of whom are of childbearing age, some of whom are going to be pregnant in this school, and it is those kind of exquisite exposures that happen at just the right or just the wrong time that can have negative outcomes. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not going to pretend to be one here. I'm just saying there are real risks that we're trying to prevent. I think the goal of that kind of preventive action is benefited by having more information that can come from these tests. And as a person who believes in that other aspect of the precautionary principle, that we should, whenever possible, engage the public effectively in decision-making processes like these, I think we should do so from a position of knowledge that the fear is there. The fear is there now, might it be a problem? I will say personally that I have a child in school here in Montpelier. The Montpelier elementary and middle schools are quite old. If you don't know them, they're only a couple of blocks from here, but they're quite old. And about 3 weeks ago, we got a note from the superintendent of schools letting us know they had been tested for PCBs and that they had no elevated levels that were of concern. And I have to say, I appreciate it. I mean, it's something I think about a lot. I mean, I work in this area, but I think about it. I knew the tests were going to take place, and I was pleased to hear that. I think all parents deserve to know, deserve to have that sense of comfort that can come from a test that shows there is no problem. And if it's a test that shows a problem, I think they have a right to know that too. Not because not necessarily because it's an acute problem there, but yes, it will likely spur some action, and I don't mean it to be more than necessary. But I know our same school did have some problems with lead, and I wanted those shut down. And because no lead in your body is a good thing; it's all bad. And I appreciated the tests that found the problem that led to preventive action. And so I say this mostly from a policy standpoint, wearing that hat, but also just as a parent. It is useful, important information to have. I think from the policy making standpoint, so you can have a better handle on it. as you make the bigger decisions down the road, and from the aspect of just as policymakers, doing what you can to help parents understand where and when there might be a risk that could be dealt with. And I hope and trust that there are different ways of doing it. Not every situation is going to end up like Burlington, even when you find elevated levels. Mr. Chapman had some conversation about that, and I certainly agree. So I think I'll stop there just to say we would support continuing forward with the testing program, and there were other aspects of that bill that could be looked at as you take the broader approach of looking at the needs of schools. We support that, but we prefer not to have that system, that plan, that activity of testing paused.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your testimony. I like and be a great organization. A few things. I don't think anyone in this room or anyone that I know doesn't think we should rid all of our buildings of toxins. Like that should be what we do here in America. One of the many things we do here in America. So I 100% agree with you, especially school, especially where kids are. I think generally the opposition or the confusion that folks have had with this PCB program is just that it seems, at least anecdotally, that the rollout of it has been difficult for some schools, and that the lack of financial support by us, by the legislature, has not been forthcoming. So I think that's the crux of this problem. And then a question I have that I should have asked 3 years ago when Burlington got tested is, why has it taken us so long to act on PCBs? I know Rachel Carlson had to write Silent Spring for us to do something on DDT. Like, when we found out PCBs were toxic and we stopped producing them or stopped using them, why didn't we do something? Like, why 2023? Why are we doing this now? It seems arbitrary. And anyway, go ahead. I'll let you answer.
I don't have the perfect answer for that, and I fear that it is. I fear that it's because of fear that if you test, you may find it, and if you find it, you're then obligated, if you have an elevated level, to do something about it. And I think that's not a good justification as a matter of public policy to fail to do the investigation. Failing to test does nothing to make the school any safer, the problem any better, you know? And indeed, if your child is in a middle school and you wait 2 more years, that could be the other 2 more years they're in that classroom or something. It's like I applaud you and your predecessors and colleagues for taking this on, and I recognize Vermont is perhaps alone in taking even this step of looking at the schools. But it makes so much sense, and I'm afraid there isn't a good answer for why it hasn't been done before. It's just that it's costly, and policymakers probably fear that, gosh, if we let people know what's really out there, we might have to do something about it.
It doesn't speak all that well of some of the work that our government's doing, frankly. It's been how many decades now?
I don't know.
We have a
Paul,
little bit
sorry.
FDA also has been slow, not FDA, EPA. We've heard historically it's been slow on these and the feds around all sorts of toxins. And it is like what you were saying early on. I remember when we had the PFAS outbreak in Bennington, things will go on the market in the United States until they're proven to harm people, then they're pulled it back. Whereas the rest of Europe now, or the rest of Europe, they're sort of examined, and then when they're shown to be safe, then they go out in the market. So it is kind of, I feel, this messed up system.
So I had heard Cecilia ask this question through testimony and had the same question myself. So I actually asked Dr. Hornbuckle just because she has a longer sort of arc of experience working in PCBs. And her response was that up until probably around 2015 or so, the toxicology and our understanding of the major exposure route of PCBs was through fish consumption and food consumption. And so the primary focus on things was to clean up sediment and try and remove PCBs from the food supply and deal with major industrial sources. And it was really about, we're working on maybe 10 years ago at this point, where we started to have an understanding how indoor air and inhalation is a major contributing source to the levels of PCBs in blood serum. So that was her explanation to me as to why we're sort of pivoting our approach to dealing with these things.
That can certainly be part of it as well. I wouldn't dispute that. Even cleaning it up from waterways has not been easy. And to your point, Senator, when what about paying? I know there are efforts underway to try to hold those who make these products. I mean, it is our position in a general matter and across all sorts of particular issues. If you make a mess, you should clean it up. And those who put this chemical into our environment and into products, I think do bear responsibility, and they have been held to account in some places. And I think that's something that is a policy matter, or perhaps as a legal matter, the state should be looking at as well.
So given the business that you're in, I know you're familiar with the possible disconnect between EPA levels and Vermont state standards and PCBs. Do you have an opinion on how to approach that gap?
It's a fair question, Senator, and I do not, and I just don't have that level of expertise. I generally look to those who I respect, and I think Dr. Levine and others in the Department of Health have made. I've read their positions and they seem reasonable to me. I do know that there have been many times where it is the states that tend to press for standards that are more protective of public health, and that the federal standards tend to have a floor that is higher, I guess, or less protective, let me put it that way, than other chemicals that I have a greater expertise in. I think the feds have not been sufficiently protective of public health. I can't comment on the specifics of the PCBs as you are wondering. It's a fair question.
Just a question for Mr. Chapman. Has there been any advertisement, just like public information put out about testing? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. And if you don't tell it like it is, it just spreads and gets more convoluted.
Sure. We've been working with our partners at the Agency of Education to try and have meetings with superintendents, principals, and facility managers in advance of that district going into the testing program. So close enough so that they'll be sort of familiar with what's going on, but not too close when the testing takes place.
So nothing public.
I'm not sure that we've done a general sort of state public effort and maybe that's something we should think about.
Yeah, because information, knowledge is power.
Knowledge is
And
power.
information is gonna, if you don't put it out, people start, the rumor mill in Vermont is wide and well. It just just gets worse. So I talked to Chair Lyons the other day about, one of the replies I gave to people that contact me about stopping the testing is that our community has some of the highest cancer rates in Vermont. Why, if this is causing it, would you want to know rather than put your grandkids through the same schoolhouse? And they weren't aware of it. So.
And Chair Lyons will be involved if this committee's interested in really still moving something. There's no way it doesn't go to health and welfare at this point. Yeah, we've got to have a look at it.
And she was just giving me information about maybe we should have a public meeting.
Yeah.
If there is a problem. But sometimes you're better off, you don't want to information out, but you don't want to keep it all secret.
Mr. Chair, can I just have,
Yeah, please.
before I step aside here, the question about whether state standard versus the federal standard is good, but I just remind the members of your committee that there have been probably dozens of cases over the years, many that I have worked on, where the state of Vermont has established policies that are substantially more protective than the federal government, and that has included lead, not just in drinking water, but in products for children, for instance, in BPA, in water bottles and other plastics, phthalates of plastic.
PFAS is a classic.
PFAS is another
And now the
example.
feds have caught up.
And they do because states press forward. After all, the states are the laboratories of democracy, and you would hope that it wouldn't be necessary in things like protecting public from exposure to toxic chemicals, but it is, and there really have been many times where Vermont and its plenty of other states too have gone forward, and typically because perhaps they have identified a threat in their community, in their state, that has caused them to look into it and caused them to go further. And so I am not one who thinks, oh, that's the federal standard, that's protective enough as a general matter.
Yeah, but opening the aperture just a little bit, I mean, go back to the European example, there's different standards there as well. So somewhere we've got to figure out what's the acceptable standard to move forward.
That is your challenge, for sure, as policymakers, and what persuades you to come down on one side or the other. And it's what is the thing being used for, and so forth. I mean, we used to grapple with these questions. And remember when kids used to have sneakers that light up when they stepped down and it had a little mercury battery, and they said, it seems to me the standard there ought to be 0. Like, why are we putting mercury in kids' shoes just so they can light up? I know it's cool, but that's the policy that we should have to say no to that. And now the state's moving on that. Vermont became the first state to ban pointer lights, but Vermont was the first state to ban mercury in compact fluorescent lighting. And when we do it here, that's going to remove mercury from all lights. I mean, California followed us then, but mercury shouldn't be anywhere, things like that. And sometimes it takes leadership, and I appreciate your grappling with this and considering it and considering our comments today as well.
We appreciate it. Really good to see you. Yeah,
One
final question.
last, and then I will never speak of this again, never. I know, sorry. All I would say is that I think as the legislature, if we're gonna demand this and require it, we should be paying for it. That's all I'm saying.
Mr. Burns, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Committee, we're going to adjourn until Vince gets to his car, and then we'll reconvene. Let's take a 5-minute